Their lives had changed forever. Not because of the scandal, not because of the headlines, but because love, real, unexpected, and unshakable, had held when everything else tried to tear them apart. Marilyn Thatcher was no longer just the 62-year-old CEO with boardroom clout and a hardened reputation. She was the woman who had risked everything for a man half her age and watched the world laugh at her for it. Until 2 nights ago. Until he stood before that crowd, straightened his jacket, and spoke words no one expected from a man so young. Now, the laughter had stopped. Strangers who once sneered couldn't meet her gaze. Former colleagues sent flowers. The press rewrote their stories. But none of that mattered. What mattered was the way he had looked at her before walking up to that stage. A quiet, steady look. The kind that said, "Even if they never understand, I do." She hadn't spoken much since the gala ended. There was too much to feel, too much that words would only flatten. So she sat in the stillness, holding on to the echo of his voice. Not the words themselves, not yet, but the way they landed. The hush, the tears, the stillness in the room when he finished. It was no longer about proving anyone wrong. It was about finally being seen, fully, honestly, openly. For the first time in a long time, Marilyn wasn't defending her choices. She was living them. It started in the most ordinary place, an industry panel in Chicago. Marilyn Thatcher, keynote speaker. Elliot Graham, junior product designer. She barely noticed him at first, but he noticed her. Not the title, not the tailored suit or the decades of leadership behind her name. He saw the way she paused before answering hard questions, how her voice softened when she talked about people, not profits. He approached her after the panel, polite, respectful. No hidden motive. "I liked what you said about legacy," he told her. "Most people my age don't think that far ahead." She smiled, one of those small, careful smiles. She was used to compliments that came with angles, but his didn't. And then it kept happening. Coffee at the same cafe. Conversations that stretched past lunch. 2 people who should have been on opposite ends of a career and a lifetime, suddenly caught in a rhythm neither had expected. By the time he asked her out to dinner, she was already waiting for him to ask. When news of their relationship broke 6 months later, the reaction was instant and brutal. Whispers in the boardroom, anonymous comments online. She's old enough to be his mother. He's clearly after her money. She must be desperate. Marilyn pretended not to hear. But Elliot heard everything, and he remembered it all. Not out of bitterness, but because he knew that one day, he'd need those words. Not to fight back, but to show them what they never saw coming. The gala had been planned months in advance. It was her legacy event, Marilyn Thatcher's final year as CEO. A farewell, a celebration, a gathering of power and prestige. But no one talked about her career that night. They talked about Elliot, about the age gap, about the ring on her finger, about how she looked in a gown beside a man 32 years younger. "She's ruining her reputation," someone whispered near the hors d'oeuvre. "I give it a year," another laughed. 2, if she keeps the checks coming. Marilyn heard them, not every word, but enough, and yet she never flinched. She had faced down hostile takeovers, congressional panels, and market crashes, but nothing, stunned like being seen as a fool in the eyes of those who once respected her. She walked into that ballroom with poise anyway, chin high, shoulders back, Elliot beside her. He didn't squeeze her hand or whisper reassurances. He just walked with her, like it was the most natural thing in the world. But inside, he was carrying something. Something he'd written, rewritten, folded, refolded. It wasn't part of the event. No one expected him to speak. But he'd asked the organizers, quietly, privately, just 10 minutes. That's all he needed. 10 minutes to give the world a different kind of headline. 10 minutes to say what he had waited years to say. When they called him to the stage, most assumed it was a mistake. Some thought he was presenting an award on her behalf. Others assumed he was just a brief interlude, a charming distraction before the real tributes began. But when Elliot stepped up to the microphone, unfolded a small sheet of paper, and looked straight into the crowd, the room quieted. No music, no murmurs, just breath, held, uncertain. He didn't start with a joke, or a thank you. He started with a memory. 3 years ago, he said, I walked into a room where I didn't belong. A panel of executives, all older, all sharper, all more polished than me. But there was one woman, one voice, that didn't look through me. She looked at me, and something in my life clicked. Some smiled politely, others rolled their eyes. But he kept going. I know what many of you think. I've heard the jokes. read the comments. I've seen the way you look at her and then at me. You think this is a transaction? That I married her for comfort or status or worse?" He paused, just long enough for the weight to settle. "But if you'd ever been loved by Marilyn Thatcher the way I have, if you'd ever heard her whisper your name when she's proud, if you'd ever watched her fight for people who'd given up on themselves, you'd understand. Age is the least remarkable thing about her." Someone shifted in their seat. Someone else wiped their eyes. He wasn't reading anymore. "You think I'm too young to know what real love looks like. But I know this. If I live to be 70, 80, 90 years old, I will spend every one of those years trying to be worthy of the woman you called a fool." By the time he finished, there was no applause. Not yet. Just stillness. And then, quietly, slowly, it began. Hands meeting palms. A standing ovation that built from the back of the room forward. Marilyn didn't stand. She sat in her chair, eyes damp, hands folded. Not because she was moved, but because she'd never felt so fully understood. The next morning, Marilyn woke to silence. Not the kind that feels empty, but the kind that feels earned. No more reporters at the gate. No more calls from board members suggesting quiet separation. No more emails implying damage control. Instead, there were messages. From women she hadn't heard from in years. A retired judge in Vermont. A former executive from San Diego. A widowed professor in Ohio. All saying the same thing in different words. "Thank you for showing us it's never too late. He saw you the way we hoped someone would one day see us. You weren't foolish. You were brave." The story had gone viral. Clips of Elliot's speech were everywhere. On morning talk shows, news sites, even stitched into wedding reels. But Marilyn didn't care about virality. She cared about the way Elliot looked at her when they were alone. She cared that he didn't speak to defend her. He spoke to honor her. They sat on the back porch that evening, wrapped in a single blanket, watching the sun slip behind the trees. No gala, no cameras, just two people, one life. He reached over, took her hand, and said softly. They stopped laughing. She turned to him, eyes gentle. "I know," she said, "but you didn't do it for them." He smiled. "No," he said. "I did it for the woman who saved my life, just by believing in hers." It had sat there for days, neatly folded, no envelope. Just her name written in his handwriting. Marilyn had seen it every morning, on the nightstand beside his watch and the cufflinks he rarely wore. But she hadn't opened it, not out of fear, but out of fullness. The kind that makes you pause, because what if the words inside only confirmed what she already felt? What if they deepened the ache? But tonight felt different. Not heavy, not urgent, just quiet and ready. She opened it slowly. No date, no greeting, just his voice on paper. "Marilyn, if you're reading this, it means I finally said what I needed to say, the way I needed to say it, out loud and in front of the people who needed to hear it most. You've taught me that love isn't about proving anyone wrong. It's about standing beside the one who sees you fully and still chooses you daily. I knew from the moment you looked at me like I belonged, before I'd earned it, before I'd even believed it myself, that you were the home I didn't know I needed. They mocked you? They misunderstood us, but they didn't break us. You led companies. I watched you move rooms with a sentence. But the thing I admire most, you never stopped making room for me, for truth, for love. No matter what comes after this, no matter how the world tries to rewrite what we built, I want this one thing to stay true. You were never a fool. You were freedom." Always, Elliot. It wasn't about noise anymore. The buzz faded, as all headlines do. The speech that once trended was replaced by something else. Another scandal, another viral clip, another fleeting moment. But for Marilyn and Elliot, the echo remained. Because it had never been about the crowd. It had been about the quiet that followed. They didn't give interviews, didn't write a book, didn't try to defend or capitalize on what happened that night. Instead, they traveled. Small towns, quiet bookstores, long walks where no one recognized them. He started teaching at a local college. She mentored young women in leadership, quietly, personally, no cameras. People still whispered sometimes. A woman that age, a man that young. But fewer whispers came with judgment now. More came with curiosity or admiration. Some even came with hope. Because slowly their story stopped being a spectacle and started becoming a possibility. At one gala the following year, someone else's this time, a young executive approached Marilyn. Nervous, wide-eyed. "How did you know?" she asked. Marilyn looked over at Elliot, who was speaking to someone across the room, smiling without performance. Then she turned back, calm and certain. "Because when he looked at me, I didn't feel younger, or older, or judged. I felt seen, and I hadn't felt that in a long, long time." Even as peace returned to their lives, one question lingered. Not from others, from within. Not a question of doubt, but of why them. Why had their story survived what so many others couldn't? Why had love, so uneven in years, so mocked by the world, found such solid ground? Marilyn didn't ask it out loud, but Elliot could always tell when it crept in. It was there in the way she paused before introducing him in public, in the way she sometimes tucked her hand away when photographers passed, in the way she stared a little too long at old pictures of herself, younger, sharper, untouched by whispers. One evening, as autumn colored the trees outside their window, Elliot spoke. "You still wonder if you should have chosen differently," he said, not accusing, just noticing. Marilyn didn't deny it. She just lowered her gaze and said quietly, "I wonder if I made it harder for you." He knelt beside her. Not dramatic, not staged, just close. "You didn't make my life harder," he said. "You made it real." He rested his head against her arm. "You taught me that love isn't always applause. Sometimes it's being willing to walk into a room full of doubt and not flinch." She looked at him then, not as someone younger, not as someone who came after the peak of her career, but as the one person who had stayed through all the noise and listened. "They called me a fool," she said with a soft smile, "but I've never felt wiser." A year later they returned, not because they had to, but because they were invited, together. The same ballroom, the same stage, different tone. This time Marilyn wasn't being honored for stepping down. She was being celebrated for everything she had quietly built after. Mentorship programs, scholarships for older women starting second careers, a quiet movement that began with whispered ridicule and became a reason others stood a little taller. When they entered the room, there were no camera flashes, just a ripple of acknowledgement. Respect. Not spectacle. Elliot didn't speak this time. He didn't need to. Marilyn did. She stepped up to the podium, not to defend, not to explain, just to share. "A year ago," she began, "I stood here under a microscope. People questioned my judgment, my dignity, even my worth. But someone stood beside me who had nothing to gain and everything to risk. He didn't promise to protect me. He didn't ask to be believed. He simply showed up and stayed." She turned slightly, met Elliot's gaze, and that's what love does. It stays. The applause was different this time. No polite claps, no half-hearted glances. It was full, earnest, earned. She didn't cry, but Elliot did. Not loudly, not visibly. Just a small tear caught in the crease of a smile. Time, as it always does, softened everything. The buzz faded, the headlines were archived. The speech became a footnote in someone's graduation address. And Marilyn and Elliot, they simply lived. They didn't chase relevance. They didn't try to prove a point. They bought a house near the water, a little too big for two people, just how she liked it. Mornings were for walking trails, afternoons for reading aloud to each other, something Elliot started and Marilyn pretended not to enjoy, until she began requesting the next chapter. There were health scares, a surgery, a year when Marilyn stepped away from everything public. But Elliot stayed close, not as a caretaker, as a partner. They stopped counting the age gap after a while, stopped explaining themselves at gatherings. When people asked how long they'd been married, Marilyn would smile and say, "Long enough for the world to change its mind." They still received letters from strangers, widows, divorcee, retirees, young people estranged from their families, all writing the same thing in different ways. "You reminded me that I'm not too late. You gave me the courage to try again. You helped me believe in love with no expiration date." Marilyn kept the letters in a box by the fireplace. She never read them twice. She didn't need to, because once was enough to know. That love, quiet, unwavering, ordinary love, had spoken louder than every headline that ever mocked them. They didn't throw a party, didn't book a trip, or rent a venue. When their 10th anniversary arrived, Marilyn and Elliot simply stayed home. Just the two of them. The day began without ceremony. No streamers, no toast, no photos for anyone else to see. But the meaning was thick in the air. 10 years. 10 years of whispers that had quieted, of doubts that had dissolved, of love that had settled into something deeper than declarations. Marilyn lit a candle at breakfast, just one, and placed it beside his coffee. He raised an eyebrow. "One?" he teased. "One is enough," she said softly. "It represents staying lit." They sat on the porch most of the day, watching the tide roll in. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. In the afternoon, Elliot brought out a small gift. No ribbon, just wrapping paper folded carefully. Inside was a simple frame, a photo of her, not from the gala, not from their wedding, but from a day in the kitchen, hair tied back, reading a letter from one of the young women she mentored. She had tears in her eyes, pride in her posture, and the faintest smile that only he had noticed at the time. "This," Elliot said, "is the moment I knew I'd never leave." She didn't answer, just reached for his hand, held it, and closed her eyes. There were no speeches that night, no standing ovations, just the sound of waves, and the quiet certainty that they had walked through fire and found something softer on the other side. It became their ritual. Every Sunday, just before sunset, they walked to the same bench overlooking the water. No matter the weather, no matter the week, it was never about the view. It was about what they didn't say out loud, the way she'd lean into his shoulder, the way he'd squeeze her hand twice, once for now, once for always, the way the silence felt shared, not empty. They watched the seasons change from that bench. First came the reds and golds of autumn, then the bare stillness of winter, the green flicker of spring buds, and finally the heavy warmth of summer sunsets. They aged there, not suddenly, not tragically, just honestly. Marilyn's steps grew slower. Elliot's hair turned silver at the temples, but their eyes never dimmed when they looked at each other. One Sunday, after sitting in silence for nearly an hour, Elliot spoke. "You know, if they had never mocked us, if they had never doubted, you still would have loved me," Marilyn finished. He smiled. "Yes, but I wouldn't have known how much." She nodded, resting her head on his shoulder. "Sometimes," she whispered, "they have to break you open, just so the right person can see inside." They sat that way until the sun dipped below the waterline. Then they stood, slowly, together, and walked home. It arrived in the spring, not by email, not typed, handwritten, stamped, addressed only to Marilyn Thatcher. She knew the handwriting instantly. Elliot had written it months earlier, given it to their attorney with quiet instructions. Deliver it only when he was gone. He had passed away peacefully 2 weeks prior. No hospital lights, no machines, just the quiet of their bedroom, her hand in his, and a final breath that left the world smaller. She hadn't spoken much since. Grief didn't come in waves. It settled like fog, gentle, constant, and all around her. But the letter waited, and on a morning touched with birdsong and too much quiet, she opened it. "Marilyn, if you're reading this, then I've gone ahead, just a few steps. Not far. Never far. I don't have final words, not really. I said everything while I had the time. I looked at you long enough, held your hand tight enough. I hope you always felt that. But I wanted to leave you with this. You were never just my great love. You were my great teacher. You taught me how to be brave in silence, how to walk into fire without flinching, and how to stay. You were mocked, yes, but you were never alone. You stood taller than any rumor, and I was the one lucky enough to stand beside you. Keep sitting on the bench. Talk to me if you like. I'll be listening. Always, yours, Elliot." She folded the letter. Tears didn't fall, not yet, but her hands trembled with the weight of being loved so completely. She rose, wrapped herself in his old sweater, and walked to the bench by the water. She sat and waited for the sun. Sometimes love doesn't arrive when we expect it, and sometimes the world misunderstands what it can't define. But when two people choose each other, quietly, steadily, and without apology, they don't just rewrite their story, they rewrite how the world sees love itself. Marilyn Thatcher didn't ask to be defended. She simply chose to love out loud, even when it cost her everything, until the world stopped laughing long enough to listen. And Elliot? He didn't try to fix her past. He simply stood in her present, and in doing so, gave her a future no one saw coming. If this story touched your heart, we'd love to hear from you. Share in the comments. What moment in Marilyn Thatcher's journey moved you the most? And if you were listening closely, you might notice how often Marilyn Thatcher's name came up. Drop your answer in the comments. We may feature your name in a shout-out as a thank you for being part of our Fiction Echoes family. If you enjoy meaningful stories like this one, the next chapter is already waiting. Just click the video that's about to appear, and we'll see you there. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and tap the bell so you never miss a moment of what happens next.